For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Marley. I'm the interim executive director with Friends of the Wissahickon, and I'm so grateful to have you all here tonight. Do we have any new members or new friends here for the first time coming to our Valley Talks? Welcome. We're so grateful to have you. I'm going to talk a little bit, very briefly, about FOW, just so you can get to know us a little bit. And I'm going to advance my slides while I'm doing that. So Friends of the Wissahickon was founded in 1924. We like to say this year we are 100 and wonderful. And that theme wonder is woven throughout our Valley Talks this year. We are a membership and volunteer supported organization. And so everything that we do with the support of the community. Our mission is to conserve the natural beauty and wildness of the Wissahickon Valley and stimulate public interest therein. And that dual nature is very important to how we achieve our work. What do? We improve the Wissahickon. We conserve it through habitat restoration. We improve the infrastructure through infrastructure projects like that beautiful $3.5 million bridge project that we just installed upstream from here. And we remove invasive species and plant native plants. And then we host events and educational opportunities like this tonight. And that's really to educate the public and engage them in that work to conserve the park. And like I said, we really can't do that without you. If you're not a member already, I hope you'll consider joining as a member. Or coming out to an event and volunteering with us. And or download the MAP app or join the All Trails Challenge. If you don't know about the All Trails Challenge, we are currently hosting the 10th anniversary of the All Trails Challenge. It's an event in which we challenge members to hike or explore all 50 miles of trail throughout the park. And it's currently running, and we encourage you to join. It's a great way to get to know the park and get to know the community that cares for the park. So we hope you'll join us. I just want to welcome Univest. We are so happy to have them sponsoring our fall series of lectures tonight. Univest Financial Corporation is a trusted regional financial services company with deep roots dating back to 1876. They are headquartered in Souderton, Pennsylvania, and they offer a comprehensive range of services, including banking, insurance, and wealth management. Their offerings serve individuals, businesses, municipalities, and nonprofit organizations across the Mid-Atlantic region, including FOW. With over 50 locations, they build a reputation not just as a financial partner, but as a community partner, one that invests time, resources, and expertise in helping people and businesses thrive. We're so grateful for their support, and we're so proud to have them be sponsoring our fall series. Please join me in thanking them. And let's welcome up Sylvia McNally, the Assistant Vice President of Univest.
Good evening, everyone. It is my honor to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Timothy Grieve-Carlson, an assistant professor and Gibson Jinko Chair in the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Westminster College in New Wilmington, Pennsylvania. He earned his Ph.D. in Religious Studies from Rice University in Houston, Texas in 2022. Timothy was also a 2021-2022 fellow at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on the relationship between environmental phenomena and religious practice. His book, American Aurora, Environment and Apocalypse in the Life of Johannes Kelpius, Oxford University Press 2024, explores environmental knowledge and apocalyptic thought in the religion of the early modern mid-Atlantic world. His academic writing has appeared in journals like American Religion, Journal for the Study of Religion, Nature and Culture, Correspondences, a Journal of Esotericism and Magic, Ritual and Witchcraft. Please welcome Dr. Timothy Grieve-Carlson.
Thank you all very much for being here, and thank you for that lovely introduction. Much appreciated. My name is Timothy Grieve-Carlson. I'm so happy to be speaking here for the Friends of the Wissahickon this evening. This is a really special place for me. I'm sure it's a very special place for all of you too. And I'm excited to talk a little bit about the book that I wrote about one of the Wissahickon's most famous residents, Johannes Kelpius. So the book that I'm going to be talking about tonight, this kind of emerged from my Ph.D. research at Rice University from 2016 to 2022. As I was sort of looking for topics to pursue for a PhD, I was working on the religious history of early America. I was working on kind of esoteric and more kind of like occult and mystical forms of religious practice in early America. And a series of names kind of kept coming up. One of them was Johannes Kelpius, a name that I actually read for the very first time, I think, in this book, Weird Pennsylvania. Maybe some of you are familiar with this one. It's like a coffee table book of sort of like spooky, fun Pennsylvania history. A really kind of great book. And I read in that book a few things that turned out upon further study and further reflection not to be true. Among them, that Kelpius was the leader of a doomsday cult, right? Actually, the leader of the very first of many doomsday cults in American history, right? Also that Kelpius was a member of a secret society, right? A secret fraternal order. In the course of doing this research and learning about this man, Kelpius, as I mentioned, I learned that a lot of what you find out about him upon first Googling his name is actually not true. But what is actually true about him, the actual man that emerges from the primary sources, the Kelpius of history, is, I think, honestly, much weirder, much more interesting, and I think perhaps just as worthwhile as the Kelpius of legend, who exists in books like Weird Pennsylvania and on the big obelisk by the cave just down the trail over here. So I'm going to talk about both Kelpiuses this evening. I'm going to talk about the legendary Kelpius and the historical Kelpius. I think they're both kind of important and worthwhile, despite being very different things. I'm also really excited to be giving this talk here in the Wissahickon Valley. As I mentioned a moment ago, I love this place. I think it's beautiful. I think that it's kind of unbelievable that we have this an urban park like this right next to the city of Philadelphia, where basically immediately after kind of like getting onto the trail, you feel secluded. Yeah. The Wissahickon has a very, very kind of special quality, I think. This is something that you can't really capture as a historian reading a primary document, but I think this place has a kind of charisma. There's a kind of vibe here. Yeah. And actually, many, many people, including Kelpius, have said as much in print over the centuries. And I'm just going to share a few passages. Since we're in the Wissahickon, I want to talk a little bit about what a few other people have said about the Wissahickon. I always tell my students when they're giving presentations, if you're giving a PowerPoint and half the text is screen, you're doing it wrong. And so I'm very sorry here. I'm doing it wrong. This is from a book by a guy named William Cobbett. Cobbett was a British pamphleteer in the early part of the 19th century. And he was a very early example of what we now call travel writing. He wrote travelogues. No one used to write travelogues because people didn't really have that much opportunity to travel. But Cobbett was one of the first. He was a British person. And this book, Rural Rides, is about the sort of beauty of the British countryside. And as an American, I take a little bit of perverse pride in what he's about to say about the Wissahickon here. He writes, "These are the fogs that sweep off the new settlers in the American woods. I remember a valley in Pennsylvania in a park called Wissahickon, and looking from a hill over this valley early in the morning in November, it presented one of the most beautiful sights that my eyes ever beheld. It was a sea bordered with beautifully formed trees of endless variety of colors. As the hills formed the outsides of the sea, some of the trees showed only their tops, and every now and then a lofty tree growing in the sea itself raised its head above the apparent waters. I have never seen anything so beautiful as the foggy valley of the Wissahickon." Must have been tough for a British guy to write that, right? Writing about the beauty of Great Britain, right? So I kind of love Will Cobbett for saying that about the Wissahickon Valley. The next author who sort of sung the praises of the Wissahickon was an American himself, Edgar Allan Poe, of course. Many of us are familiar with him. This is from a magazine piece that he wrote in 1844, a magazine called The Opal. He writes, "Now the Wissahickon is of so remarkable a loveliness that, were it flowing in England, it would be the theme of every bard and the common topic of every tongue, if, indeed, its banks were not parceled off in lots at an exorbitant price as building sites for the villas of the opulent. Yet it is only within very few years that anyone has more than heard of the Wissahickon." So Poe is saying a few things here, right? If he's saying that if this place, the Wissahickon Valley, if it was in England, if it was in Europe, right? This would be the only thing that Romantic authors talked about, right? They wouldn't be talking about the English hill country. They wouldn't be talking about the Lake District, any of this stuff. No, no, no. The Wissahickon blows them all out of the water, right? This place is that beautiful. Like I said, this place that we're sitting in right now has this kind of charisma. It has this sort of, I want to say, otherworldly ambiance, right? There's a special feeling in this place that successive centuries of authors who have spent time here have really noticed and committed to writing. The earliest, I think, author who described this place that we're in right now is Johannes Kelpius, who I'm going to be speaking about this evening. This is in a 1706 letter. This is actually the last letter that he wrote that still exists today that we know of. I think it's probably one of the last he ever wrote. He passed away shortly after writing this piece. He writes, "O ever-blessed wilderness, thou rejoiceth and blossometh as a rose. Yea, thou blossometh abundantly and rejoiceth even with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon is given unto thee, the excellency of Carmel and Sharon." Lebanon in the Bible, this, of course, modern country, but also ancient place, was renowned for these enormous cedar forests. So when Kelpius says the glory of Lebanon, he's actually sort of speaking with reference to the Bible about the forests of the Wissahickon and the trees of those forests. "In thee we see the glory of our Lord and the excellency of our God. In thee our weak hands are strengthened and our feeble knees confirmed. Who would not desire to be a denizen in thee? Who would not delight to trace thy solitary and lonesome walks?" 1706, Kelpius's English is pretty non-standard. He's actually just learned the language pretty recently when he's writing this letter. So it looks like there's a few typos in there, and maybe there are, but a little bit of it is Kelpius's non-standard English. This sort of reflection on the not only the beauty, but also the spiritual significance, the spiritual potency of a wilderness location is actually vanishingly rare in the Christian tradition during this period. This is one of the things that we're going to see that will sort of make Kelpius stand out as a really unusual figure in a variety of ways. One of the things that made Kelpius sort of strange, even in the radical religious context of early Philadelphia, early Pennsylvania, is his belief that the natural world, the physical cosmos, what Christians might call creation, right? What we would today call the environment, right? The natural world, is actually one of the primary ways that human beings can sort of interface with and communicate with divinity, right? That spending time in a wilderness setting in a place like the Wissahickon is actually not only a source of kind of aesthetic beauty and maybe recreation as we might understand it today, but it is really kind of the closest that human beings like we can come to having a sort of direct interface with nothing less than the sort of mind and writing of God itself in the world. Yeah. As I go through this talk this evening, I'm going to describe a little bit of why Kelpius felt that way, where this perspective came from, why it was so unusual, and why this particular figure chose this place to sort of settle in and reflect on in this way that we can see here. So if you've ever hiked in the Wissahickon, you've come across this structure, probably. Let me see some hands. How many people have been to this site? Nice. Wow. Okay, cool. I love doing this. Okay. Lots and lots of people have been here. I even see my friends on Zoom are raising their hand. Beautiful. Yeah. This, when most people, if you were to Google the word Kelpius, or if we were to sort of start looking into Kelpius in any way, this site is the very first thing we would see. This sort of structure built into a small hillside here. We have this dark stone doorway leading down into a cellar. And if you've been inside, the ceiling is kind of arched, right? Maybe it's like 15, 20 feet down. Usually there's some pretty fun graffiti to look at. I was just in there earlier today, and I took some photos. There's usually some pretty interesting residual stuff left over from whatever people were getting up to in the cave earlier. Next to the cave, you may have noticed this obelisk with this writing on it. This obelisk was placed here in 1961. I can't really do math, but Kelpius died in 1707. One of you can probably figure out the difference between 1961 and 1707. I can't. It's a big number. However many hundred years later, this obelisk is set up here. Johannes Kelpius, Ph.D., born 1673, died 1708, the first Rosicrucian colony in America. This is a beautiful obelisk. It really commemorates a lot of the legendary significance of Johannes Kelpius and the way people remember him today. You don't need to read the text on this obelisk very closely because none of it is actually true. None of it is historically true. But nonetheless, the message here and the story being told here is really, really significant for understanding that legendary Kelpius who I mentioned a moment ago, right? This figure who kind of emerges long after the historical Kelpius has left this world. We get this legendary figure, this wizard, this Rosicrucian, the leader of the first Rosicrucian colony in the United States, Johannes Kelpius. So at this site here, in this cave and on this obelisk, we see this legendary figure commemorated. And if you were to look more closely into the story of Kelpius, if you were maybe to do a little bit more Googling, you would start to see things like this. This is a newspaper article from the early 20th century. Philadelphia girl owns Stone of Wisdom. The story that this article tells is actually about a young woman in Philadelphia who is able to recover the Philosopher's Stone from the bottom of the Schuylkill River. Which was unfortunate because she got it, right? We can't get it. She has it. Yeah. If anyone is conversant in the history of alchemy, you know that the Philosopher's Stone is this legendary substance which can transmute base materials into gold, lead or some other sort of like base materials into gold. But if you know a little bit more about alchemy, you know that this desire to sort of transform matter, to transform the nature of matter, is not merely material, right? For the ancient alchemists, the quest to transform matter was also a quest to sort of transform the real stuff of the human body, right? The human body and the human soul. And the quest for the Philosopher's Stone in the ancient alchemical tradition was the quest to not only find the route to the perfectibility of matter, but to perfect the human soul, right? In this context, alchemy, chemistry are actually spiritual pursuits, religious pursuits. And in the historical memory of Kelpius, we can see really clearly that Kelpius has become associated not only as a person who was interested in alchemy and practiced alchemy, but clearly in the legendary memory of Kelpius, he was a great alchemist. He was an alchemist who actually achieved this ultimate goal. He created the Philosopher's Stone. And then at the end of his life, he had somebody fling it into the Schuylkill River, where this young woman picked it up in the early 20th century. I'm sure she's doing well these days. I mean, she has the Philosopher's Stone. I'm sure she did just fine after this. Unfortunately, we can't get it. Amidst all this enormous body of legend, right, and hyperbole and sort of speculation and storytelling about this man who lived in this place, there was a real man. There was a real individual named Johannes Kelpius who really did arrive here in 1694, who really did settle with a few colleagues up on the ridge, just a few miles this way, who really did kind of live this very unusual, kind of beautiful, strange life at the edge of a British colony at the end of the 17th century, and who really did exert an enormous influence on American religion and American literature and American culture, who I think is actually, as I said before, much more interesting and strange and worthwhile, perhaps, than some of the legends we've heard about him so far. And so, having sort of explored the legendary Kelpius a little bit, I'm going to tell us just a little about the historical Kelpius, about the man who really existed. Kelpius was born in 1667. He was born in a tiny little village in what is now Transylvania. He was German. He was ethnically German. He was part of an ethnic community of Germans in Transylvania that were called the Transylvanian Saxons. They actually came to what is now Romania from Germany in the medieval period. Kelpius's father was a Lutheran minister. His mother died just a few years after he was born. The sources don't tell us much of anything about Kelpius's mother. Kelpius's father died when he was just about 18 years old. Kelpius was not a member of the nobility. He was not a person of means or of much advantage, but his father was a pastor, and he certainly went to school, and he must have done very well in school, because we know that after his father died, his education was sponsored by a trio of noble people from a neighboring Romanian city. They paid for him to go to college. He must have been a talented, precocious young man, right? He must have been someone who was viewed as being gifted in this way. He leaves Transylvania when he's 18 years old, and we actually know from a later source written in Transylvania that after he leaves, he never returns, and he doesn't communicate with his family ever again. I don't know why that might be, right? We can only speculate on why this might be, right? But clearly, he had no interest in returning. When he left for good. He arrived in Leipzig, the German city of Leipzig, to begin graduate work. I believe, I'm not certain, but I believe after looking at his matriculation in Leipzig that he intended to study law. But he only lasted for 6 months in Leipzig. He didn't stay there very long. While Kelpius arrived in Leipzig, Leipzig was the center of a radical movement within German Protestantism called Pietism. Pietism was a radical form of Christian practice that emerged after the Protestant Reformation that was a really kind of harsh reaction to some of the orthodox successes of Lutheran Protestantism. In particular, Pietists did not recognize the sole authority of Lutheran orthodoxy, and they believed that the best way to sort of practice Christian life was through developing a highly emotional and even individual relationship with Jesus. Yeah. If this sounds sort of familiar to us, maybe like a perfectly ordinary way to be a Christian, this is because Pietism ended up being wildly successful. It really reformed Protestantism from the inside. In the late 17th century, Pietism was intensely radical. People got killed for being Pietist. It was an extremely radical movement within Christianity. In 1667, at Leipzig, one of the early leaders of the Pietist movement, a gentleman named Augustus Hermann Francke, is leading a small group of Pietists, a small group of devotional radical Protestants who are gathering in private homes for these private services called conventicles, where they get together, they study the Bible together, and then kind of strange things happen. We have lots of reports from these conventicle meetings that they start out as Bible study, and then they become these sort of like ecstatic devotional events where supernatural manifestations take place, miracles take place. Yeah. I'm going to describe Kelpius's report from these conventicle meetings in Leipzig in just a moment. Augustus Hermann Francke's group disbands in, what year is it? Top of my head. I believe it was 1687. His group disbands in Leipzig. In 1687, Kelpius also leaves Leipzig. He leaves this university that someone has paid him to go to. He leaves Leipzig and he goes to Tübingen. He goes to Tübingen and he enrolls in a program to study theology. Now, I cannot say for certain, right? But I believe that when he was in Leipzig, Kelpius encountered the Pietist conventicle of Francke, and he encountered a form of Christian life that just totally transformed him, right? And when Francke eventually left Leipzig, Kelpius said, I want to travel to another center of Pietist thought. I'm done with studying to be a lawyer. I want to continue my Christian vocation, and I want to follow in the footsteps of these Pietists. And so he goes to Tübingen. I'm going to read Kelpius's description of the kind of activity that happened at Pietist conventicles. So in this letter, he's writing to a minister from Rhode Island, actually, a gentleman named Stephen Mumford, who asked him to explain Pietism. This gentleman wrote to Kelpius and said, can you tell me what Pietism is and what Pietism means to you? And Kelpius says, sure, I'd be happy to. So many university students in places like Leipzig got together and they burned their copies of Aristotle. They burned all the stuff they were reading. They got together and read the Bible, And then this happened. And I'm going to read this now, and it's going to seem like I'm having like a medical episode. The English is non-standard. And like as the miracles wrought by God through the hand of Moses was for the main part in the outward creation or macrocosm, the miracles of Jesus, the Messiah, on the bodies of man for the microcosm, so these in our days was wrought, much like unto them in the days of the apostles, on the soul and more interior parts by ecstasies, revelations, inspirations, illuminations, inspeakings, prophecies, apparitions, changings of minds, transfigurations, translations of their bodies, wonderful fastings for 11, 14, 27, 37 days, paradisical representations by voices, melodies, and sensations to the very perceptibility of the spectators who was about such persons, whose condition as to the inward condition of their souls, as well as their outward transactions, yea, their very thoughts they could tell during the time of their ecstasies, though they had never seen nor heard of the persons before. So what Kelpius is describing, or Kelpius is saying, the sort of miraculous manifestations that took place during the Pietist movement are part of this general movement throughout the history of the world, which for Kelpius is the history of the Bible, right? And he says, during the life of Moses, we see all these exterior miracles. We see all these sort of cosmic miracles, right? The Red Sea parts, right? The sky is darkened, 7 plagues kind of miracles, yeah? During the life of Jesus, we see these miracles that take place in the human body, right? Healings, exorcisms, right? Ascensions, yeah? And then he says, now, during this time in history, during our life, we continue to see events he's talking about the early Pietists. We see events that basically are like the events of Acts of the Apostles, right? Acts of the Apostles being a book of the Bible that tells the story of the very earliest Christian movement, right? The apostles after the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, in which miracles are taking place all the time, right? And these miracles are, without exception, there's one exception, but almost without exception, these miracles are direct external sign of God's attention and goodwill. Supernatural manifestations come from God, and they're a sign from God, right? A sort of approval and goodwill, yeah? This is exactly the same time that folks like Increase Mather, right, and the Puritans in England and New England are also paying special attention to miracles, yeah? But they're saying something very, very different, right? They're saying any sort of miraculous or supernatural manifestation that happens these days, 100% without a doubt, is the work of the devil on earth, yeah? These have an infernal origin, right? Kelpius and the other Pietists are reading texts like Acts of the Apostles, and they're saying, I don't think this is the case, right? They're saying clearly, if you look at the biblical text, miracles are happening. They continue to happen in the present day, right? And these are an unambiguous sign of divine goodwill, yeah? Another thing, a more sort of like personal, historical, biographical detail here. Kelpius is, when he writes this paragraph, when he describes the life of the early Pietists in this letter, he's speaking from personal experience. And so he's speaking from his perspective as a young man. He's gone to Leipzig to study law. And in Leipzig, at least to hear him tell it, right? And we can't be sure what he really saw, right? As a historian, this is sort of beyond our reach, right? But he says, as a young man in Leipzig, young students like me saw things that they could only compare to the Acts of the Apostles, yeah, to these sort of miracles of a kind of biblical magnitude. So when Kelpius is asked to describe pietism, when he's asked to describe his perspective as a Christian, this is the kind of thing he says. Yeah, this is the words from his own mouth about what pietism means for him and his perspective as a Christian. He goes to Tübingen. He continues his studies in theology there for about a year. When he's a year into his study, the King of France, Louis XIV, invades the Palatinate, the southwestern region of Germany on the French border. It's a horrific, horrific invasion. It's actually one of the very first modern instances of what historians now call total war, where the civilians and the farmland were targeted as well as combatants. It's a really, really terrible invasion. Kelpius flees Tübingen with everyone else, and he goes to another German university in a city called Altdorf, where he finishes his Ph.D. in theology at a very young age. He's in his early 20s when he finishes his PhD. Hard to do in the 17th century or these days. That's a big notch in his cap. Finishes his PhD, and at this point, it's 1691. Kelpius could have gone on to do all kinds of things. He could have been a professor. He could have gone on to a really prestigious career, right? He could have been a pastor. He could have been a leader in the church. Could have done all kinds of things. He writes a few academic essays. He publishes a dissertation, which I'm going to read a few translations from here in a moment. He publishes an essay on the church fathers, and then he writes a long essay on Aristotle with one of his advisors. And then after that, he stops writing. At least he stops writing anything that I can find or that other historians have found. The next thing we hear from Johannes Kelpius, 3 years later, 1693, he's preparing to flee Germany for Pennsylvania with a group of some of the most radical pietists on the continent, people like Johann Jakob Zimmermann, folks who are so radical that they're under direct threat of imprisonment or worse from German authorities at the time. So we don't know exactly what happened, but somehow between the years 1687 and 1693, Kelpius went from a promising young law student who a bunch of Transylvanian nobles paid for his education to this lapsed theologian who was making arrangements to flee Europe with, from the perspective of the Lutherans, some of the most dangerous criminals, theological criminals that Europe has to offer, right? So he undergoes this thing he's describing here, and this sort of transformation of Christian life that overcomes him really does change his life trajectory in an enormous way. The late 17th century was an intense and turbulent time in a lot of ways, right? I'll try to avoid doing the professor thing and giving all the context, but history was changing in numerous ways at the end of the 17th century. History wasn't the only thing that was changing. Historians and climate scientists now recognize the end of the 17th century as a kind of peak in what climate historians call the Little Ice Age, this period of global cooling that struck the Northern Hemisphere in particular at the end of the medieval period and really peaked at the end of the 17th century. Global Northern Hemisphere temperatures decreased by about 2 degrees Celsius annually during this period. This seems like a small number, 2 degrees Celsius. We could all use 2 degrees Celsius cooling annually, right? These aggregate measurements really represent enormous local effects. The goal of the United Nations Climate Accord, back when we had such things, was to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius annually, right? The recognition being that anything higher than this would represent an irretrievable disaster for our species. Yeah, so 2 degrees of global cooling annually, we're talking about a really, really significant climate event. At the same time, we're starting to see Christian authors during this period talking about the natural world, creation in explicit detail in their theological writings. And they're talking about it in exactly the way that we're about to see Kelpius talking about it. They're talking about the natural world as one of the ways that God expresses himself on earth, right? As one of the ways that God sort of communicates with human beings, as one of the media through which human beings can kind of interact directly with divinity. And these sort of environmental theological concerns are one of the major things that Kelpius is going to write about in his PhD dissertation. This is it here, published 1689, Natural Theology, or the Metamorphosis of the Metaphysics. And I'm just going to show a few passages from this here. But in this text, in his dissertation, Kelpius tries to answer a really, really simple question. And the question is going to sound extremely silly to us, but it did not sound silly in the 17th century. He writes, "The fact that God exists has always been a great consensus among all people. But whence indeed did the cognition concerning God appear among the pagans? Did God send them word from above? By no means. In the 17th century, Europe has just made contact with the indigenous people of North America. They've made contact now with people all over the world who have no relationship with the biblical text, right? Not Jewish people, not Muslim people, right? People for whom the biblical text is a very live part of their tradition. They're meeting people who have no relationship with Scripture, yeah? One of the main tenets of Protestantism, of Lutheranism, is what Lutherans call sola scriptura, the only source of divine authority that human beings have access to, comes from the scripture, comes from the biblical text. Yeah. The only way that human beings learn about ethics or morality or decency or philosophy or anything like this comes to us from the biblical text. Yeah. And then very quickly, Europeans meet all these people who have no relationship with the biblical text. But not only are they, in many ways, clearly wise, clearly knowledgeable, at this time in Europe, one of the most kind of fashionable and interesting intellectual questions was how exactly Native North American people were so morally and ethically well-formed and robust, right? 100 years later, Rousseau is going to write about this a lot, right? This is a very common genre of writing and speculation in Europe at the time. Not only how do Native American people know anything at all, right? But how do many of them make ethical arguments that we have a hard time responding to, right? Not only do these people seem to have access to ethics, they seem in some cases to have access to a form of ethics that in some ways is sort of beyond us, right? And later these days, if anyone has read David Graeber and David Wengrow's book, The Dawn of Everything, right? This is actually like a major sort of intellectual thing that happens during the Enlightenment. Graeber calls it the indigenous critique, and it's sort of one of the ideological origins of what becomes liberalism and the Enlightenment, the sort of like political preference for freedom. I'm getting way ahead of myself here. Kelpius is asking in this dissertation, how do these people know about God? How do they know so much of what they know about if they don't have access to the scripture? Did God send them a different scripture? Did a whole other revelation happen? No. In his dissertation, Kelpius puts forward this argument that God did not send more than one scripture. He did not make more than one revelation, right? But God actually wrote two books. One of them being the Bible, right? One of them being the scriptures. The other one being the physical world, creation. Yeah. Kelpius writes, but because it would have been possible to more potently mislead them by a word, it happened that by placing his creation in the middle, and here the Latin is a little bit tortured, but by placing between humanity and himself this third thing, this interface, the environment, the world, the cosmos, creation. Yeah. He writes, so that a wise man, a barbarous person, by looking at those things that were subjected to his eyes, when he says barbarous person, right, he just means any non-Christian person. A thinking person who does not have access to the scripture can look around the world, right? And having been taught beauty, they might be able to ascend to God. This is the point Kelpius is making. He's saying, how do people who have no access to scripture not only know anything at all, why are they all kind of rather like brilliant and beautiful and in some ways more advanced than we are, right? He says, actually, creation is a pretty viable medium through which God communicates with us all the time. And this is how this happens. As I said, this question sounds kind of absurd to us today, but it was so important in the late 17th century. European intellectuals were really, really banging their heads against the wall on this one, trying to figure out how exactly this happened. And here Kelpius offers an answer. But I shall also note it from an Orthodox Lutheran perspective, it's a somewhat heretical answer, right? He graduated, he got his Ph.D., but this is not Orthodox Lutheranism. Early on in his academic career, Kelpius is clearly expressing this really sort of like radical bent. Yeah. And we can sort of see a little bit of evidence for what ends up happening when he makes this decision to leave Europe and travel to Pennsylvania in 1694. This is the cover page of Kelpius's letter book. It's at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. It just says in Latin, literal copies of letters sent from the wilderness of Pennsylvania, Johannes Kelpius of Transylvania. And then we have this sort of interesting thing happening with the numbers here. You can see 1694 to 1703, -4, -5, -6, -7. Kelpius dies in 1707. He doesn't send any letters in 1707. So it's hard for us to know, it's hard for me to know exactly what these numbers mean, right? But sometimes one of the things as historians, we're limited to working with stuff like this. We're limited to working with pen and ink on paper. In these letters, one of the things that Kelpius is going to describe is after 1703, a kind of deteriorating physical condition. Kelpius starts to get sick, and he never really recovers until he dies in 1707. And I think what these numbers might mean, -4, -5, -6, -7, is in 1703, he puts the end date on his letter book. He doesn't think he's going to send another one. And then January 1704, he puts -4. He still doesn't think he's going to send any letters after this year. And then the same thing happens 05, 06, 07. And then 07, he doesn't get to add another letter to the end of the book. I think, and when we read this letters, we can see this really clearly. He's overcome by this sickness, and he lasts for quite a few years afterwards, but he never fully recovers. And he does pass away at the age of 41 here in the Wissahickon. He probably passes away in Germantown. He's probably brought down into Germantown by some friends, but he passes away fairly quickly afterwards. 40 is not an excessively young age to die in 1707, particularly at like the edge of a British colony, especially an individual who was sort of practicing some rather austere religious and kind of ascetic behaviors, but nonetheless a sort of tragic and unfortunately early end for Johannes Kelpius. He arrives here in 1694. We spent a couple hours at the site of where he was earlier today. Some of the legendary stories will kind of tell it that Kelpius and his colleagues built this enormous facility on the ridge of the Wissahickon with a huge telescope, right? 40 by 40, filled with monastic cells. All of the primary sources that describe the place they lived referred to it as either a small house or a cottage. I think that the place they built for themselves was really small. I would be really surprised if their community ever hit double digits. I think it was a small group of people. I think it was probably all men who lived together. They definitely had women visitors. There were definitely women who were affiliated with the community, but I think the group was really all men. At the time, I alluded to this a little bit before, Philadelphia is a really small town. It's 2,000 people. Most of those 2,000 people are religious minorities who have fled persecution of some kind in Europe. I made this joke earlier today, but if you were an ordinary European person walking down the street of Philadelphia in 1694, you would have thought these people are freaks, right? You would have really thought this was like the strangest of the strange had come to Philadelphia, right? Because of course, these are ideological and religious minorities fleeing persecution, yeah? In contemporaneous sources from the period, Kelpius is actually identified verbatim as the strange one among strange ones. So even in a place like Philly, a guy like Kelpius stood out, right? And as we saw a little bit in some of that earlier writing, and I'm going to show us here in a moment, Kelpius really saw himself as practicing the earliest and purest form of Christianity. He modeled himself after the life of figures from the Bible who he admired. He really wanted to practice the form of Christianity that he saw in books like Acts of the Apostles, right? Before orthodoxy of any kind had stepped in to corrupt the church, right? He wanted to practice the original purest form of Christianity, yeah? And even in Philadelphia at the end of the 17th century, trying to do this for real would really make you stand out. And this is what happened with him. This is one of the letters from Kelpius's letter book that I've spent the most time with. The title is Of the Threefold Wilderness State, the Barren, the Fruitful, and the Wilderness of the Elect of God. This is one of the last letters that Kelpius wrote during his time at the Wissahickon. He wrote it to a woman named Esther Palmer, who was a Quaker missionary from Long Island, who must have met with Kelpius on the ridge, and they must have spent some time together. We know this because the first few paragraphs of this letter, Kelpius says, when we last got together, I started talking to you about this, and our conversation got cut short, and I didn't really have the chance to finish what I was trying to say, and I wanted to lay it out really clearly in this letter. And this is what he does, and he sends her this letter. And in this piece, he describes what he calls the threefold wilderness state, which is Kelpius's kind of mature theological reflection on the meaning of the biblical text, the nature of the human relationship with God, and the way that sort of escalating kind of contemplative and intuitive relationship with the natural world, with wilderness, as he calls it in English, is really the only form of spiritual development available to us as Christians. And this is how, as Christians, we can get closer to God, through this sort of contemplative practice in the wilderness, as he calls it. This is a passage from the letter. This one he wrote in English, and at this point his English is pretty good, 1706. The darkest sorrow contains in herself the most inward joy and gladness. Darkness is like the light. To die in this pleasant wilderness is to grow lively. Poverty maketh rich. Hunger is the most desirable meat, and thirst the most refreshing nectar. To be nothing is to be deified. To have nothing is to enjoy all. To become weak is the greatest strength. So if anyone is sort of familiar with the history of Christian monastic literature or kind of Christian literature of any kind, Kelpius is deeply conversant in the biblical tradition. I mean, if one of my students cited this many sources in a paragraph like this, I'd be ecstatic, right? Kelpius clearly knows what he's talking about, and he fills all of his writings with these ample references to the Bible. He's practicing in this very, very ascetic Christian mode, right? Of denial, of purification, right? And really of kind of, the only word for it is mortification, right? The sort of like transformation of the flesh into something spiritually perfect through denial. Yeah, when he writes, to become weak is the greatest strength, right? He's talking about how the sort of gradual dissolution of the self, and that includes the body, is a form of kind of spiritual development and spiritual strength. Kelpius didn't only write theology and letters at Wissahickon, he also wrote a lot of beautiful poetry, quite a lot actually. This is also with the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. This collection is titled, he has these great titles, The Lamenting Voice of the Hidden Love at the Time when She Lay in Misery and Forsaken and Oppressed by the Multitude of Her Enemies, composed by one in Cumber. And the title, of course, goes on. This is a collection of poems that Kelpius wrote with his friend, an English botanist and alchemist and astrologer named Christopher Witt. These poems are set to music, and they're also written to be sung by multiple voices. So when Kelpius is at Wissahickon, he doesn't do any academic writing. He doesn't participate in any controversies. He doesn't print any pamphlets. He doesn't engage in any of the religious polemics at the time. He writes letters to friends and colleagues and co-religionists, and he writes poems that you need a group of people to sing. So really his practice had really transformed. He's still doing something very unusual, right? This is really community writing. This is writing that is meant to be used and read and referred to by a small community of people. So I'm going to show us one passage from one of his poems. And I took us on a hike earlier today. I took us out to a place in the Wissahickon that I think inspired part of the piece we're going to look at. In this poem, this one is entitled Of the Wilderness that I'm going to read from. Kelpius is writing from the perspective of this person who is kind of reached like an impasse in their spiritual development. They're not making any progress. They're feeling thwarted. They're feeling sort of challenged. And in this poem, the speaker encounters this man, this guy named John, and John encourages the poet, the singer, with this series of metaphors, natural metaphors for spiritual development that really show how spiritual development is something that happens in this deeply sort of like ecological mode of relatedness to the natural world and the natural processes that constitute it. Kelpius writes, and this is John speaking to him. This is this anonymous sort of encourager. Think, he said, how the current flow pushes itself onward, how by being very still, the river demonstrates its depths. One cannot see the depths, nor the reason of love until her sun's radiance comes to stand over her. So I'll keep reading here in a moment, but if you're standing where the hermitage was, where we think it was, and then you walk down what they call it, the yellow trail down to Lover's Leap, you're going to look over the cliff, and the Wissahickon Creek takes this steep turn through really shallow rock, and you can't hear it because the cars are going by, but the water gets really loud there because the river is shallow, yeah? And Kelpius is saying here, quietness, right, is actually suggestive of depth, right? And he's speaking about this river and how when a river goes silent, when it goes still, right, that's actually how you know that there's some real depth there, right? I don't know, but I think that maybe that little bend in the creek might have inspired this verse that I just read. He goes on, think how gold so deep in the bowels of the earth, lying hidden, growing, and it should be useful, so it must shine glowing, like lightning weather. This is a German phrase that doesn't really work in English, that it can sit on hand and brow like crown and scepter. Thinking of the spreading roots, the seeds in the earth, which are hidden, yet growing full of strength, so grows the hidden love as it bears its fruit, that winter's fury and storm should never kill its growth. Even in 1705, when Kelpius is writing here, he spent his whole life living through some of the harshest winters that Europe has ever seen. And I think that very last line there, winter's fury and storm should never kill its growth. Of course, he's being metaphorical. He's talking about the challenges that the soul faces. But I think he's also speaking just from the experience of a European person living through this moment of really extreme climate change, which he did during his early life. As I said, Kelpius died in 1707. We think his group probably disbanded fairly quickly. We know that one hermit, a gentleman named Conrad Mathai, stayed there for a few decades after that. Many of them went on to be very, very influential in different ways. Conrad Mathai, in particular, ends up being the sort of tutor and early kind of teacher of another gentleman named Conrad Beissel, who goes on to found what becomes the Ephrata Cloister, another sort of utopian religious community in early Pennsylvania, which I think really modeled itself in some ways after the Kelpius community, but on this enormous scale. Ephrata really was a huge facility, the only printing press in the colonies that was as big as Ben Franklin's, huge facility composed of celibate communities of men and women, huge mystical Protestant community in early Pennsylvania, really inspired, I think, by the Kelpius community. Kelpius also goes on to sort of instantly seed all of these legends around him, right? We know just a few decades after he dies, a Lutheran missionary named Henry Melchior Muhlenberg is traveling around Germantown. He starts asking about this group of weirdos who lived up on the ridge, and he gets this story about how one of them on his deathbed had this object in a box, and as he was dying, he asked someone to go throw it into the river. And this gentleman says, okay, yeah, I'll do that. And he goes down he knows what's in the box is so important. And at the last second, he hesitates and he can't throw this thing into the Schuylkill River. It turns out it's the Philosopher's Stone. This is what he had. He goes back up on the ridge and says, yeah, I did it. I threw it in there. And this mysterious figure is like, no, you didn't. I know you didn't. And he says, you're right. I didn't. I hesitated at the last minute. And he goes down the ridge and he throws it in, and there's this enormous thunderbolt. And he knows that at that point he has thrown the Philosopher's Stone into the Schuylkill River, whereas we now know it rested until 1911 or so when that woman got it out of the bottom of the river. But legends like this sprout immediately after Kelpius dies. He's instantly this kind of person that people want to tell these stories about. If you haven't figured it out already, this is clearly the Excalibur story from King Arthur, where at the end of King Arthur's life, he tells this person to dispose of the sword, and he panics at the last minute, doesn't do it, and then at the end, the hand finally reaches out and grabs it. This is clearly King Arthur, but it's like remixed in Germantown in 1740. And instead of Arthur, we have Kelpius, and instead of Excalibur, we have the Philosopher's Stone. This sort of like legend mongering just proliferates in the centuries that follow Kelpius's life. I'm almost finished here. There's one more kind of major thing I'm going to describe. The thing that really sort of inspired me to try to write a whole book about this guy was actually kind of realizing the role he played in this novel here. This novel is entitled Wieland. It's by a Quaker Pennsylvania author named Charles Brockton Brown. I could talk about this novel all day. I'll spare you guys. I'm very confident that this novel was inspired in part by the sort of memory of Kelpius and people like Kelpius. The first thing that happens in a novel is a radical German pietist travels from Germany to Philadelphia. He establishes a sort of temple on the ridge of the Wissahickon in the precise location where Kelpius's temple was. He wants this sort of personal, ecstatic, individual relationship with divinity, and he doesn't really respect any church authorities. And at the end of, and this is where it gets kind of crazy, one night, a lethal column of light comes out of the sky and kills him. I don't think that happened to Kelpius, right? But so far we can see the parallel really, really clear. The novel is this like fascinating exploration of how Enlightenment, rationalist, Republican, sort of Jeffersonian figures should interpret supernatural phenomena. And whether, when we encounter supernatural phenomena, whether we should try to dismiss them and debunk them, as is the kind of Jeffersonian, rational Enlightenment mode, or should we adopt the approach of traditional religion, which is assume that they are kind of direct communications from God meant for us, kind of the perspective of Kelpius and his colleagues. In the novel, Brown suggests this sort of middle way. He suggests that there's actually something deeply wrong with both approaches, and paranormal phenomena require a much deeper intellectual engagement than traditional Christians or people like Jefferson are willing to give them. Crazy novel to be like one of the first major novels in American history, but there it is. And I read it, so you guys don't have to. But we can see it even at the very earliest moments of American literature. Before, who's the guy that wrote Sleepy Hollow?
Washington
Irving, thank you very much. Before Washington Irving, before Poe, before all these figures, we have authors like Charles Brockden Brown. And when authors like Charles Brockden Brown write some of the very first lines of the literature that will become American, they're thinking about people like Johannes Kelpius. I find this tremendously significant and worthwhile, and just makes the actual history of this man just widen for me, and in ways that I think the legend sort of doesn't allow us to engage with. So I want to give plenty of time for questions, but as I wrap up, I'll just sort of conclude on this note. What we have here in the Wissahickon Valley and in the primary sources, and I think in the actual kind of atmosphere here in the valley, are two Kelpiuses, a legendary Kelpius and a historical Kelpius. The historical Kelpius, as I said, is, I think, maybe stranger, maybe more interesting, right, than the legendary Kelpius. But I think the legendary Kelpius is no less significant, right, and maybe no less worthwhile. It took me a long time to sort of understand this, and the gentleman who finally helped me understand it, he's an architect in Philadelphia named Alvin Holm, who former head of the Kelpius Society and really brilliant, beautiful man. Philadelphia is a city that commemorates itself relentlessly, right? You can't walk down a block in Philadelphia and not see one of those little blue signs saying so-and-so was here, right? So-and-so lived here. This is a city that commemorates itself constantly, and the stories it tells about itself are national, they are entrepreneurial, right? They are, in some cases, militaristic, right? In the story of the revolution, and they are incessantly public. Yeah, the story of Kelpius is secret, right? It is spiritual, right? And it speaks to these truths that I think the city of Philadelphia has just demanded of it, right? A sort of antithesis to the history of the city that we see sort of commemorated all around us, right? That's what's been up here waiting on the ridge for the people of this city since 1740, when Henry Melchior Muhlenberg ended up hearing the story of King Arthur from someone down in Germantown. So that's why I find the legendary Kelpius maybe just as worthwhile as the historical one. I'm going to stick around. Thank you all very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I think we all have like a little bit of Kelpius in us, honestly. But we're going to take some time to do Q&A. And so why don't we take some questions from the room first, and then we'll have some questions from our participants on Zoom, which I'll read from my phone. But for the questions in the room, Timothy, if you wouldn't mind just repeating the question, so that way our friends on Zoom know what you're answering.
Sure.
Thanks so much.
Yep.
Does anybody have any questions?
I saw your hand go up first.
Like fundraising, like how did he manage to live?
Great question. The question was there fundraising? How did they manage to live? I did find a source to this effect. It was two Swedish Lutheran pastors down in Gloria Day. You all know this one. It's like on highway. It's south, and they're complaining to one another about the cost of Bibles and bookbinding in the New World, in the British colonies. And one of them, a gentleman named Andreas Rudman, writes to another, I have contracted a godly man named Johannes Kelpius to bind Bibles for us. It costs way more than buying the whole book in Sweden, and he really takes his time. And this is what he says, basically. So I think that part of how Kelpius made his money was using things that he learned in his academic life. I think that they probably accepted a little bit of money from some students. We definitely know that some children took lessons from the monks on the ridge. And I think they probably made their living kind of doing odd jobs. They lived such an austere lifestyle that they probably didn't need very much. And I also know that, especially during their journey, they were wholly dependent on charity, and they received a huge amount of money from different radical Protestant groups during their journey, like big amounts of money, like amounts that I was sort of shocked to read about. So there was this kind of like intense solidarity in the radical religious underground of Europe at the time, and he made his way kind of doing odd jobs. Yeah, good question. Sir, on the edge here.
You know, life expectancy back then was, so you talked about the solution of the body. Do you think it's something that you put into practice and probably is why he didn't live so long?
Yeah, it's a good question. The question is, maybe did some of his ascetic practices contribute to his death when it did happen? I really have no idea, right? So I can't say for sure why exactly he died. I know that many of the men he lived with lived for decades after him. So perhaps Kelpius was really extreme, right, in these practices, or perhaps he died of something like tuberculosis, which his religious practices could have exacerbated, but certainly wouldn't have caused. And so the short answer is, I think you're probably onto something, and I just don't know. Yeah, very good question. Yes, please, go ahead. Yeah.
I can understand the concept of like writing a letter or there's something that one place, another place telling something about something important style, but how would you find out about like a friend group in Europe if you're in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, great question. The question is how would information have traveled in these contexts? How would you have found out about this group of people in Pennsylvania when you're in Europe at the time? So two things. The first thing I'll say is, like, one of the things that this research has taught me in really granular detail is, like, the whole world was just such a small town back then. There were 2,000 people in Philly, right? It really was a lot fewer people. So that's part of it. The other thing is sometimes information didn't travel. So the gentleman who founded Ephrata, Conrad Beissel, arrived in Pennsylvania in 1720. He showed up in Philadelphia and said, I've heard of this guy named Johannes Kelpius. I want to apprentice myself to him. I want to join his community. And someone must have told him Kelpius died 13 years ago. So in this case, information like didn't travel, right? So yeah, it's a great question. And there are networks, right? Like there are networks in which information travels pretty quickly, but still, like, you're relying on pen and paper that has to travel by boats, and the boat trip, if you're really lucky, takes a couple months. Yeah, stuff did travel pretty slowly. Good question. Yeah, gentleman, checkered shirt.
Is it possible that Kelpius died of radon poisoning? Pretty much all the rocks around this whole neighborhood.
Yeah, the question was, is it possible that Kelpius died of radon poisoning? And I guess I can't rule it out. This is the first suggestion I've heard of it. I suppose I can't rule it out. Yeah, I mean, yeah, well, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure if he did spend a lot of time in caves. I can't rule that out either. There's nothing in the primary sources which suggests that he'd spent any time in caves. But he was like predisposed to excessive behaviors in all kinds of ways. So maybe he did. Maybe that was part of his practice. Certainly there are legends about him in that cave, right? But yeah, good question. I really can't rule it out. Yeah, your hand's been up for a while.
Yeah, so I understand that in the like colonial Christian period, that wilderness often had negative connotations.
Yes.
Whereas Kelpius said it's very positive. Did that put him at odds with the local community at all, or?
Great question. The question was, did Kelpius' sort of positive religious attitude towards the wilderness put him at odds with the local community? He was unusual in that belief in some ways. I don't think that put him at odds with the community. It's sort of a long story, but when Kelpius and his friends show up in Philly, some of his close friends immediately get involved in this controversy within the Philadelphia Quaker community called the Keithian Schism. I won't tell you guys all about the Keithian. If you want to learn about the Keithian Schism, you can Google it. It was basically it was a controversy within Quakerism where all of Kelpius's friends enthusiastically jump in as partisans on the side that loses badly, very, very quickly. And so instantly they're alienated from the wider, not only Quaker community in Philadelphia, but they make some important enemies among the German radical pietist community here, in particular Francis Daniel Pastorius, who actually writes some public polemics against the Kelpius community, just because he hates these guys. He's like, these are not my kind of guys. Yeah. And so what's interesting, Kelpius never participates in any of this. Kelpius never seems to engage these controversies at all, but all of his best buddies do. So they're alienated in this way. But this doesn't really have to do with his religious beliefs specifically. It's that, his friends just dove into the wrong side of this argument. Good question. Yes, please, in the back, and then halfway up.
Question. So how were his writings kind of collected afterwards? Because he said, obviously we have this original publication in Europe, we have all these letters, we have these poems. Is there an archive today? I mean, it just seems like over about 300 years or so. How is this work gathered?
Yeah, great question. The question is, how are his writings gathered after he dies? So there's a few things that happen. Kelpius dies in 1707. His collection of books is immediately bought by, oh gosh, his name's on the tip of my tongue. He becomes the governor of Pennsylvania. He institutes the walking purchase. It wasn't Shippen. His library eventually becomes the beginning of the Library Company of Philadelphia. James Logan. His name is James Logan. So Kelpius's letter book, which also includes the diary of his trip from Europe, and his collection of poems, all instantly get into the library, which eventually becomes the Library Company of Philadelphia. Kelpius and his colleagues, these guys are nerds, they're grad students, they're PhDs. They travel from Europe with like a ton of books, a ton of musical instruments, all kinds of gear. When Kelpius dies, Logan buys this stuff. And so a lot of it enters the collections that will become the beginning of the Philadelphia archival collections very, very early. And so it's a real miracle for historians like me. This stuff I shouldn't say shouldn't, but we're really lucky that it exists. Some of the other stuff, of course, so his academic writings, I proposed this dissertation project in January of 2020. And at the time I had all these plans to go to Europe, check out these archives, do all kinds of stuff. Obviously never happened. I was able to there were librarians in universities in Europe are so nice and they're so willing to like help when you need things. And I think it also helped that I would call and say, I would hate to have to come over from Texas. And they were like, no, whatever you need, we'll scan. And so there were lots and lots of really helpful archivists and librarians. So a lot of it is luck, and some of it is librarians and archivists really do amazing work. And that's kind of, but there's probably so much we don't have. I have like 10 letters, a diary that's like 8 pages, and a few of his academic writings. There's huge gaps in the story. So it seems like a lot, and I'm really grateful for what we do have, but it's not complete. Good question. Yes, please. Yes, you. Yep. Oh, we don't know for sure. I think probably the site, which is the Hermitage Mansion, and I think that's the most likely site. On the earliest sort of maps we have of the area, that place it's not identified as the site, but Hermit Lane Hermit Street is all really, really early. That area is really clearly associated with these people. I think probably the Hermitage Mansion is our best bet. A gentleman I mentioned earlier, the architect Alvin Holm, told me once when we were spending time together that he had a hunch that the site might have been closer to what is now Lover's Leap, actually the bridge, right under that bridge, that might have been closer to the site. And he had some reasons for thinking this, but I think intuition was a big one. So the short answer is we don't know exactly, but it was somewhere in that ballpark. Yeah. Yes, please. Yeah, so this cave, we don't know when it was built. Perhaps an architecture historian or an archaeologist or someone eventually could sort of make a definitive statement. I'm inclined to think this is a late 18th century or early 19th century root cellar, as a Pennsylvania Dutch person would call it, place where you store your onions and potatoes. Keeps it very cool. Just a few things. The brick down there, brick is a very much more modern, not a 17th century building material. I don't think that Kelpius had anything to do with this structure. I think this came long after he lived and died. So that's the short answer. I should also address, because I don't think I actually mentioned this clearly in the talk. Of course, we remember Kelpius today as the leader of this doomsday group, right? He's a doomsday cultist. There's nothing in any of Kelpius's original writings to suggest this at all. Kelpius did not anticipate an imminent destructive end of the world. One of the men he traveled with, Johann Jakob Zimmermann, did predict that something terrible would happen in 1693 based on the appearance of a comet in 1680. Something did happen in 1693. Johann Jakob Zimmermann died very, very suddenly. And so the event, I think it's actually kind of poetic and fascinating in a really hermetic way. The event that Zimmermann foretold in the cosmos took place sort of in the microcosmos of his own body. Kelpius, after this prediction comes and passes in 1693, continues to Pennsylvania. Kelpius did not anticipate an imminent end of the world. Of course, as a Christian, he eagerly awaited a sort of imminent return of Christ, and his interest in the biblical book of Revelation and his religious writings reflect this. But this is something that all Christians since Paul have in common, a belief in the sort of imminence of Christ's return. And so if that makes him a doomsday prophet, then we got a lot of doomsday prophets running around. So this is why I sort of dismissed that understanding of him as a doomsday prophet. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Yes, you.
Yeah, I'm interested in that doomsday concept as it seems to evolve into Adventism in the 19th century with the Millerite, called it the Seventh-day Adventists, other Adventists. I know that, Conrad Meisel, who wanted to kind of recreate what he thought the Kelpius thing was in Ephrata, he had people, they had to take shifts to stay up all night watching for Jesus in case he showed up in the middle of the night. They didn't want everybody sleeping through it. That seems like a level of, seriousness about the second coming or the end of the world, whatever, that is beyond what your average Christian would have. So do we have any kind of indication that Meisel got any of that kind of extreme Adventism from the Kelpius group?
Yeah, I think he probably did. And honestly, Kelpius's religious writings have been such an extreme kind of religious fascination with the sky. And the sky is a particular sort of medium through which God communicates with human beings, that I actually think of all the Christian practices we see at Ephrata, I think the midnight sky watching thing is very likely to come straight from Kelpius. That just seems to me like a Kelpius style thing to do. And so maybe, maybe reasonable people could disagree here. I want to stress Kelpius anticipated the imminent return of Jesus, which for him would not herald the destruction of the world, right? Actually, in other parts of his writings, he says, I hope you look forward to the great jubilee and the restoration of all things with me, right? So what Kelpius is anticipating is actually like a perfected cosmos, right? It's really much more in line with the kind of, and I'm going to use some fancy words, the sort of Christian eschatology that we see in the letters of Paul, particularly in Romans chapter 8, where Christians are not anticipating an afterlife in which they go to heaven. They're anticipating a perfected world, And their job as Christians is to perfect this world in anticipation of Jesus's return. And this is really Kelpius's style. This is his eschatology. And I think that he gives this to Beisel too. And so, perhaps, some people could say, well, that is a doomsday thing, right? And that is sort of what he's anticipating. But typically when people identify him as the leader of a doomsday cult, they're anticipating this climactic denouement or like conclusion to this world. And that just couldn't be further from what Kelpius anticipated or was interested in. Good question. Yeah, please.
I finished the book yesterday
Wow, nice.
and I have to ask more about the dolphin.
Yes, the dolphin. Okay. So Kelpius kept a detailed diary of their travels across the Atlantic Ocean, a super detailed diary. It's the only detailed diary he kept in his whole life, which I think shows how significant this moment was for him, how just important he considered it. He tells all kinds of amazing stories. The British Channel is like a war zone at the time. They're actually attacked by French ships during their trip. All kinds of interesting stuff happens. At some point, some of the sailors haul up a dolphin, and Kelpius says, we tested out the ancient legend that these fish love music, and we're not really sure if we confirmed it. So this is basically the extent of what he wrote, right? And I used to remember off the top of my head, I can't remember right now exactly, maybe someone can help me, in which ancient Greek epic or poem or philosopher it might be Aristotle actually, the ancient belief that dolphins loved music and that you could perform music to attract dolphins. Does anybody know the source of this? Maybe someone can Google it, but it was like this sort of belief about dolphins in the ancient world. And we know that Kelpius had the presence of mind to try it when someone hauled a dolphin out of a boat. I wish I knew. He probably sung something, but I know they did travel with instruments. So who knows? Maybe they had some accompaniment. But yeah, I hope that answers your question. Yeah, that's kind of what I know about the dolphin. Yeah, please.
I was talk more about that like third option or middle ground for interpreting supernatural happenings. That novel that you mentioned again.
Yeah. The question was if I could speak more about the third way of interpreting supernatural phenomena in Charles Brockton Brown's novel Wieland. So Wieland is really it's a philosophical novel, and it's sort of like a criticism of traditional religious belief and Enlightenment rationality. And of course, in traditional sort of Christian or religious perspective, miracles happen, and they're either God communicating with you or they're the devil trying to trick you. And those are the two ways that miracles can happen. One of the major sort of like intellectual revisions that the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution and all the sort of attendant philosophical changes make is that actually no miracles have ever happened. And that this is something that human beings really need to accept and get over, right? And we really need to attend to the natural world, the world as it really, really is. And we need to get over this supernatural stuff, right? Everything has a cause and effect. Everything can be sort of understood in scientific terms. And so, for example, Thomas Jefferson famously creates his own edition of the gospel texts where all of the miracles are edited out. He creates his own version of the life of Jesus with everything supernatural removed, because he wants to get to Jesus, the ethical teacher, not Jesus, the healer, not Jesus, the exorcist, not Jesus, the supernatural figure. So there were these two really opposing views of supernatural phenomena in the 18th century when Brown is writing. And Brown takes Kelpius as sort of an example and kind of an instructive figure. And he actually tells this story about this group of people who live right here in the Wissahickon Valley who are suddenly beset by these supernatural manifestations. And there's a few characters in the novel. There's Theodore, who is a devout Christian, and he believes that all of the miracles are communications from God for him. And I don't want to spoil it, but he ends up actually doing something rather heinous in this belief. He ends up doing some pretty horrific things because he believes that God has chosen him. Theodore's best friend is a gentleman named Pleyel, who is a sort of Enlightenment Jeffersonian kind of figure, who, when these sort of things happen, when these supernatural manifestations take place, he's, gosh, this is a terrible comparison. He's kind of like a Dana Scully. When he can't instantly reject the manifestation, he just sort of throws his hands up and kind of like cowers or sort of pretends it's not happening. Yeah. The hero of the novel is a young woman named Clara, who is open to the possibility of supernatural phenomena as reflective of parts of our world that we don't understand fully yet, right? And she takes this sort of humble position of recognizing her place in a cosmos that ultimately she does not understand. She doesn't accept supernatural phenomena as God talking to her. She also doesn't reject them outright. She takes this sort of humble kind of third position where she doesn't uncritically accept things or reject things, but rather she sort of interprets the world as she experiences it directly. Does that kind of answer your question? Yeah, it actually is a great novel. I love it. It's it's 18th century. It's sort of a slog sometimes, but it really is this startling and intense and brutal at times, kind of almost surrealist Lynchian kind of piece. It's a really, really beautiful book. So many questions. Please, I saw you in the back, and then Stan, please.
Spirituality, experience through the flesh, friends himself by fasting or by not eating through the way different levels of divinity or know anything about his relationship other than that, like eating food, not eating food? You know anything about a relationship with plants in the area and also relationship with the people?
Great questions. Anything about his relationship with plants in the area and also indigenous peoples? I do know that some of Kelpius's closest friends and colleagues were extremely knowledgeable about local plants. The gentleman that he wrote his book of poems with, Christopher Witt, was actually like the leading settler authority on plants in the New World in the 18th century. In the correspondence of John Bartram and Peter Collinson, these two sort of this transatlantic exchange of botany and sort of like early scientific discovery, they're both constantly referencing Christopher Witt as the local authority on plants. So I don't know for sure that Kelpius had any like detailed herbal expertise, but I'm inclined to think he probably did. And certainly one of his closest friends on the area was the authority on it. So he certainly was adjacent to some of this knowledge. On indigenous people, Kelpius is really, really interesting in his relationship to the Lenape. He describes one story in one letter where he's invited to attend the major Lenape festival. It's called a Kintinka festival. And this is like the major, like really prestigious sort of social and ceremonial gathering for Lenape people. And Kelpius was invited to it. We know he was invited to it because he tells this story where it's kind of a long story, but in so many words, William Penn is also at this festival, and William Penn gets up and says, in so many words, here's why you should all be Christians. And in so many words, a Lenape person stands up and says, you Christians don't really live up to the moral standard you set for yourselves. We trust in God to take care of us in every way. You're the most anxious people we've ever met. Why on earth should we be Christians? And I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but the Lenape speaker really does say that. The Lenape speaker says, you spend all of your life worrying about which son will get which house and which bit of money and worrying about this stuff. And we trust God to take care of us in every way. Why on earth should we become Christians? And Kelpius reports to the person he's writing to that William Penn was abashed in this moment. So he was humiliated, he was embarrassed. And amazing story, like amazing story. And so we don't know what kind of relationship Kelpius had with the Lenape, but we know that he was invited to their major ceremony. William Penn was probably invited because Penn was the leader, right? Because Penn was a person of special political significance. Maybe they saw Kelpius as a person of special political significance. I'm inclined to think that Kelpius probably had a a neighborly or fraternal relationship with Lenape people in some way. And that's why he was there. That's the only primary source document that I'm aware of that really speaks directly to his relationship with the indigenous people of the area. Good question. Stan, I believe you had a question.
Just have to answer the myth of Arian.
Arian, thank you. Beautiful. Thank you very much. Yeah, the myth of Arian with the dolphins. Yeah, thank you.
Take a couple questions from the Zoom
Okay.
participants too.
Yep.
Have any of Kelpius's diaries and letters been transcribed and published?
Great question. The question was, have any of Kelpius's letters and diaries been transcribed and published? The answer is yes. If all of his diaries and 8 out of 10 of his letters have been transcribed, translated, and published by a gentleman named Julius Saxa. They were published in the early 20th century, and the PSU press, they release all of these like great early Pennsylvania texts. You can get a paperback for like $20, and it's all free online. So Kelpius's original writings are freely available. Yeah.
So great.
Yep.
In Dr. Arthur Versalius, Wisdom's Children, the doctor mentions Kelpius often included astrological information in his diary entries. Can you speak to the verity of this and how astrological occurrences may have influenced his thought/life?
Yeah, Dr. Arthur Versalius is precisely correct about this. Kelpius does include astrological information in his diary in particular. He notes the zodiacal signs and the sort of current astrological conditions when he's writing. So we know that astrology was super significant in his life. As I said before, Kelpius's religious interest in the sky was really intense. That's part of why the book is called American Aurora, because so much of Kelpius's own personal religiosity is about his relationship with the sky, and the sky is sort of like a medium for interface with divinity. I will say that in the late 17th century, astrology is really different than it is today, and it's also not a like marginal or unusual thing for a Christian or a theologian or an intellectual to be interested in. So Kelpius was certainly interested in astrology, no doubt at all about that. And that's all over the primary record. Yeah.
One no question, just a huge thank you. This was amazing. And then
Thank you.
Then finally, this is Hannah Sattler. She says, thank you. I'm fascinated by Kelpius and everything you shared. I was floored to hear Charles Brockden Brown's name. I'm a direct descendant of his and also of Julius Saxa. I assume you've heard of Saxa, who wrote about Kelpius, who you just actually mentioned. Based on what I've read and what you're saying, Saxa must have made up a lot of his scholarship. I'd love to hear your perspective on his role in the telling of Kelpius the legends.
Wow, thank you, Hannah. Great question. That's so cool. You're related to both Saxa and Brown. So yeah, you're right about that. Saxa, your ancestor, was he was an amateur historian. He was a passionate sort of antiquarian. He did a ton of research at the end of the 19th century, and his book on Kelpius, The German Pietists of Provincial Pennsylvania, is probably still like by far the most cited book on the subject and widely read book on the subject. Saxa, of course, was not a professional historian, and also the methods of historical scholarship at the time were just different. They were playing way fast and loose. I mean, it must have been a good time to be a historian, because you could really kind of say what you wanted. So Saxa's book preserves a ton of really valuable and worthwhile information. It also includes a ton of information which is basically impossible for anyone to verify. And it includes some information that we know that he has falsified in some way. In some cases, he has changed the name in a text. He has manipulated a text in some way. He has done something to a primary source to kind of make it work for himself. And so for this reason, the handful of scholars who look at this stuff closely don't trust Saxa. Saxa's books are really, really valuable. They're really special. They're really beautifully written. He was really passionate about this stuff, but he's not a reliable historian. And hey, who is? So that's kind of how I feel about it.
Any final questions?
Did he ignore any of the online Buddhist practices or rituals specifically?
It's a great question. The question is, did he develop any practices or rituals in relation to the Wissahickon itself? I don't know. There's no indication of this that I can be sure of. But he must have, right? I mean, he settled here for a reason, and he settled in this place because he wanted to develop this really specific sort of elaboration of sort of like a Christian wilderness mysticism, and he dedicated his life to doing this for more than a decade. He must have developed some, right? Now, I think, of course, like the Christian contemplative tradition is really robust. He would have practiced things that he could have done anywhere. Prayer, meditation. I'd be interested if there was any specific form of ritual practice. I'm inclined to think that he practiced forms of sort of ecstatic devotional prayer that we might describe as in which he almost entered like a trance-like state, right? And really sort of through like fasting, celibacy, depriving his body in all sorts of ways, really sort of deliberately cultivated kind of like visionary awareness of the divine presence. I don't know any specific like Wissahickon oriented stuff he would have done. But like I said, when I quote that passage from the one poem, I can sort of feel this place in his writing when I try to look at the two of them together, his writing and this place. I can sort of tell, but I can't say for sure. It's a very good question. Yeah, please. I think we probably have just time for one more. Great question. The question was, is it possible that he adopted any Lenape practices? I also can't say for sure. I know that Kelpius, he did seem to like respect Lenape knowledge in a sort of interesting and sort of unique way, right? He describes that episode extensively where a Lenape person humiliates William Penn, and he does so approvingly, right? He's in the letter, he's like, check this out. This happened, right? And that is that Lenape person was saying, why would we be Christians? So clearly he has some affinity for the Lenape. We know, well, I know from another piece of writing by one of his friends who lived in Wissahickon with him, Daniel Faulkner, that they learned a lot about the stars from the Lenape. They learned a lot about local astronomy and local sort of celestial phenomena, and really sort of like detailed practical stuff. They learned about, I forget the details, but when this star does this in this position, you can bet like winter is about to hit and things like this. Now, for Kelpius, knowledge like this was religious, right? Because environmental knowledge was religious knowledge. Now, did Kelpius, did he participate in like the sacred ceremonies of Lenape people? I would be shocked if he did, right? That this would be really unusual, but maybe. Yeah, it's a great question. He did have this sort of interesting relationship with them, and for him, the environmental knowledge of a people like the Lenape would have been religious in his understanding. So yeah, it's a good question.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Timothy. It was wonderful. Thank you, participants on Zoom. We will see you hopefully in October for our tree talk with Andrew the arborist. Thanks so much.